is my honor to, this is the first of a program that I've given that has talked about the award that I just received. And the Independent Press Awards, they're called the IPPIs. They have, they welcome books submitted from other countries. They just have to be English-speaking books or English, written in English. And they have about nearly 80 different categories that people submit in. And so I was honored to receive. Distinguished favorite means that I didn't get 1, 2, or 3, but I got, it's like honorable mention, and I and 5 others got honorable mentions in Memoir. So I'm very pleased about that. So get the right arrows here. Now my book is a fairly complicated book. It has different interwoven themes, and these are several of the themes. I'm going to talk about how being born in China shaped me, even though I have no memories of living there. And then I lived in Alaska for 5 years, and I'm going to talk about how that influenced me. And then how self-understanding enabled me to create a life that felt authentic to me. So this is the area of China that we're going to be visiting in chapters of the book, and especially the last section is all about China. So this is West China, as you see the inset map up there. It's far. Sichuan province encompasses the eastern rim of the Tibetan Plateau. And so the western part of Sichuan, once you get past Chengdu, which is where I was born, and you travel west, you get into increasingly more rugged country until you have these really steep mountains that rise up to the eastern rim of the Tibetan Plateau. And so that's where we're going to be visiting. And the story begins with my parents, who met in 1929 in Philadelphia. My father had completed his medical degree and was in his last years of advanced study in internal medicine. And my mother had just started her first year of medical school, and she was bound and determined to be a doctor. Dad had already been posted to the faculty of West China Union University. And they had a whirlwind courtship in the early part of 1930, and then after 6 weeks, he asked her to pack her trunk and go to China with him. That was his exact words of his proposal. And the first 2 years they were there, they were in language study because the classes were all taught in Chinese. My mother had to know Chinese to be able to just understand what was being taught. And a little bit about the school. It is West China Union University is one of 6 union universities, which means that it's interdenominational, different Protestant denominations, and the staff and the funding for the school comes from these partner denominations. And in order of support, there was the Canadian Methodist Episcopals, the American Baptist Foreign Mission Board, which my father was posted by, and then British Quakers. And so even though in the 1930s, way in Western China, it was a very remote place, this was a cosmopolitan campus. Very exciting to be in, my parents report. And then in the summer of 1932, they were finished with their language study, and my parents decided that before taking up their duties, they wanted to make a trek into Tibet. And while they were there, serendipitously, they crossed paths with the Shikong expedition, which had come to measure and climb the Minyakonka, which is the mountain on the eastern rim the Tibetan Plateau. And the two men that they met from the expedition were looking for someone who could speak Chinese and be able to teach their cook how to cook for Westerners, and also to help them set up a base camp while they were measuring the mountain to determine its height. And so my father was very adventurous, and he volunteered the two of them to do that. And they spent 2.5 weeks camped opposite the mountain. And if you can see the mountain just peeking out of the clouds there. And two more time pointers or markers. 1936, my mother graduated from medical school, and she continued to hold various positions. She was a physician for the women's students at the university, and she also was a superintendent of a TB sanitarium. And then by 1945, when we left, there were 3 kids, and I'm the middle one right there. Going to give a reading. And I'm going to read from the very first chapter when I accompany my parents back to China in 1980. And I have to say that as a child, I wanted nothing to do with China, but I had become curious once China opened up, and I'll talk a little bit about that more later. Our plane taxied to a stop in front of a drab concrete terminal. I stood and took a deep breath, gathered my travel bag and camera, and followed my parents up the aisle toward the door. Waiting our turn to descend the stairs, Mom gave me a tight smile, fidgeting with her still naturally blonde hair. Dad leaned toward me, gleeful, his blue eyes crinkling. "Are you ready for this, Jackie?" As ready. Can you hear me? Because I realize I haven't been talking into this. Okay. Sam says fine.
I mean, I got good hearing, so.
Okay. Are you ready for this, Jackie? As ready as I'll ever be, I guess. At the doorway, I glimpsed flat agricultural fields stretching into a distant haze and stepped down into the steamy subtropical air of a sunny spring day. Reaching the tarmac, I moved briskly to keep up with my eager parents as they strode toward the terminal door. 4 Chinese people waited just inside, all dressed in dark gray Mao-style jackets and pants. Only their heights defined a difference. The 2 women diminutive, the men both a head taller. All 4 were scanning the incoming travelers, mostly Westerners. I watched their expressions transform from somber concentration to elation when they recognized my parents. Mom, proceeding apace and not expecting an airport welcome, started to rush by. "Mom," I said, and put my hand on her shoulder. Then she recognized them. The women bowed shyly as my mother reached toward them. They clutched hands, all 3 smiling and crying at the same time. Dad, shorter than the 2 men, beamed and shook their hands enthusiastically. A lively conversation in Chinese broke out, punctuated by hand gestures and laughs. Dad stopped talking briefly to introduce me in English. The 4 were Mom's medical school classmates and Dad's former medical students at West China Union University. I shook hands with them, and they resumed their conversations as passengers from our flight continued to trickle by. I stood outside their circle, transfixed by the women's tender, poignant reunion. My mother's constant mask of stress had fallen away, leaving only joy. I could not recall her ever showing love so openly to me and my siblings, or even to Dad. My eyes pooled as I backed away and leaned against the beige wall. My chest tightened as if in a vice, and time slowed down. I saw only what was before me. My mother chattering away with her friends, delight emanating from her every look and gesture. I was stunned to my core. Who was this woman? Certainly not the mother I'd grown up with. So just to give you a little bit about my childhood and early adult years, we settled in a small West Virginia town, and I knew right away that my family was different from others in the town, and especially once I started school. My mother worked full time. That was unusual after World War II. They both wanted to keep China alive for them, and so they were always speaking Chinese to themselves at home. And sometimes, often, they would speak Chinese in public, which I found mortifying. And they decorated our house with Chinese things. And so I was very self-conscious about my family. I had a difficult childhood. My mother was a verbal abuser, and she could be very cruel with her words. And I did not spend time in my imagination like most children do when they play doctor or teacher and that type of things. My life growing up was focused outwards because I didn't want to set my mother off. Her rages were unpredictable, and I didn't want her aiming her words at me. And so as a result, I had little self-understanding of who I was or what I wanted to do when I grew up. And even in college, I was not more self-aware. And as it became closer to graduation, the easiest thing for me to do was and I took it, was to get married, marry my college sweetheart. And the other thing that's important about my childhood is my dad was a master storyteller, and he loved to talk about their adventures in China, and particularly in the first couple of years before they really got into their work. And his stories were part of what was really meaningful to me and helped me through childhood, I believe. And the story that I loved the most was about the Minyagonka. And I should say a lot of his stories took place in the mountains. This is a painting of the Minyagonka, and it is a somewhat romanticized painting. It was done by the wife of a missionary, because there are no trees up there, like these right here and over there. But still, this, in addition to having the stories that my father told about mountains, I had this image. So it was pretty strong as I was going on, that I really liked mountains. And my husband went to medical school after college. We had married, and in his senior year, he joined the Navy in exchange for the Navy paying for the last year of medical school, which made it much easier for us. And he was assigned to Kodiak Island. And I don't know if any of you have been to Kodiak or know of Kodiak, but it is an island 60 miles long by 40 wide, as I remember, and it's in the Gulf of Alaska, south of Anchorage. And that truly changed my life. I think living close to nature, like we did there, was healing for me. Began the healing process from my mother's verbal abuse, and just I learned about outdoor activities, and I just loved it. I loved doing it with my children. Our son was 6 months old when we went there, and our daughter was born there. And later on, we lived in Anchorage for nearly 5 years, and I'm sorry, it was just 2 years, nearly 2 years. And that's where I became acquainted with really big mountains. And Denali whoops, next one. I see the next slide up here, and sometimes it distracts me, Sam. Denali is formerly called Mount McKinley, and it's the highest mountain in North America, and it's truly magnificent. I just visiting places like this with my kids. I loved it, and even I already felt that Kodiak was my soul place, or Alaska. I got that from Kodiak, but this just cemented it. I found a passion for environmental work, which led to my 35-year career. And just the wildlife and everything there was wonderful. And then, not even 2 years after we moved to Anchorage, my husband, and I felt like my life was finally opening up, my husband came to me and said that he couldn't live there anymore, that he needed to be closer to his parents. And that was really, really difficult for me. And I'm going to do another reading, which will talk about my feelings about having to leave. We had bought a camper, and I could not get on a plane and just leave Alaska. So we bought a camper, and we left gradually and having some adventures along the way. On our last morning in the park, this is Denali, we woke to a dusting of snow. Packing up in the cold, we headed toward the park entrance. Along the way, I spotted 4 caribou trotting effortlessly over the tundra. With antlers in velvet, nut-brown winter coats, and creamy neck ruffs. They were magnificent against the backdrop of snow-touched autumnal ground cover. They moved with a lightness as if they had springs in their feet. Leaving Denali, we began our long trek south in the camper along the Alaska Highway, through Canada and then east across the plains. I lived in the moment of our adventure, glad I'd insisted we drive instead of flying across the country. Reaching upstate New York at September's end, we stopped to see Tom's relatives and picked up the red Volkswagen Rabbit he had purchased in June. The next day, the last of our journey, Tom and Johnny climbed into the camper while I drove the Rabbit with Steph. Crossing the Connecticut River into New Hampshire, I was alone with my thoughts as Steph slept. New Hampshire's landscape was pleasing, scenic vistas, forested mountains, quaint villages. But it seemed compact and tame. The immense scale and wildness of Alaska, the endless mountains, broad valleys, braided glacial rivers, and iconic wildlife defined the state's profound impact on my soul. Tears streamed down my face as I silently gave way to my grief. I didn't know what was in store for the future or for my marriage, but I wept for what I had lost. If I'd understood then the circumstances surrounding my parents' departure from China, I would have seen the parallel to Dad's leaving a situation that had been so rewarding for him. There was even a similarity in the landscapes we each had to leave. The mountains and rugged terrain that promised adventure. I wish I could have talked with him about these similarities, but this insight came later, after his death. My father, giving up what he had loved in China, looked for the benefits and opportunities offered by change and new experiences. He didn't dwell on what he had left behind, but incorporated what he had valued from past experiences in creating a new path. In my own way, I kept Denali in my heart and moved forward into my new life. So now we're going back to China, 1980, the trip that I touched on in the first chapter. And my parents had been looking for a tour that went to China for some time, and they waited until they had a tour that went to Chengdu, because most of the early tours went to the eastern provinces. And they didn't know what to expect after not being there for 35 years. And what we found was that China wasn't that much different. If you take the buses and like I think there are 2 cars in that line up the road, the street, and those would have been officials, because the regular people could not have cars at that point. And so they rode the bicycles or the buses. And the cities were sprawling, because even then there was a high population, but had a very low profile, except for the really big cities where you would have some high rises for people to live. And part of that was because they didn't have many elevators. And my parents felt that life was better for the Chinese because there wasn't the health issues that they had seen when they were there. And for me, seeing my parents' black and white photos come to life, both of these are from the campus of West China Union University. Seeing those black and white pictures come to life was just absolutely stunning for me. And 25 days later, after traveling all around China, all of my childhood ambivalence had totally disappeared, and I was really quite taken with the culture and the people and the landscape. Now we're moving forward a little bit in about a decade, and I have been visiting my parents. I'm divorced at this point, and I'm living in Vermont. And while helping my parents when they had consolidated their belongings after being in several storage places, I helped them go through some boxes, and I discovered my parents' letters written home from China from the 1930s and 40s. And I took them home to transcribe them because they were crumbling and weren't going to last very long, because I wanted to document their lives there. And I became quite taken with their story and really learned a lot about them and their relationship in doing in transcribing the letters. And I wanted to go to the places that they wrote about, and the places they had their adventures in the mountains. And I, especially for the stories about the Minyagonka, I vowed to retrace their steps to the Valley of the Yak. That's my name for the area of the Minyagonka. And in 2007, I made the pilgrimage to that valley with my son, my daughter, and my niece. And so the rest of I'll go. So this is the route we took. It's the same map as before, but it shows you the specific cities that we went through. And I talked about the topography. Did I talk about the topography before? About Chengdu being in a basin and the mountains getting bigger and bigger. Chengdu is in a big agricultural basin. It's like a breadbasket for Sichuan and beyond. But once you move into like Yang'an, my parents lived there for a year during language study. They're in rolling hills, and a lot of tea comes out of the area of Yang'an. And then there's mountain passes up to 9,000 feet high in between these two cities. This river really marks where the mountains rise up to the eastern rim of the Tibetan Plateau. And very rugged country. So this is a picture, again, all the black and white pictures are my parents, a picture of their camp beside that pond, and a picture of the mountain on a very clear day. That's my goal. I want to see I want to see that view. Now I want to give you a sense of the kind of roads they traveled. Now the one on the left is one we visited in 2007, and I'm with our driver, Mr. Chen. My parents traveled on a lot of roads like that, especially from Chengdu to Yang'an and on, and a lot of them that would go up and over the mountains. But this is a Cadillac of a road, that one right there, compared to what the stone step road was for my parents. This is the old pilgrim's path on a sacred mountain called Mount Omei. But it's in much better shape than what they would have walked. But once they got into Tibet, these are the kind of roads that they would travel on. Very, very rough. And when it rained, there'd just be water and mud rushing down that. Now the travel agent I worked with to get a driver and driver/guide, Mr. Chen, and the SUV he would have taken us to on a 4-lane highway up to Chengdu, which is up in the mountains beyond that river I was talking about. And I said, no, we don't want to travel 4-lane highways, and I wanted to, as much as I could, follow the path that my parents had taken. And so we ended up, after driving for a little bit on this dirt road, and we came across this line of cars, and I especially like showing this to people this time of year. Because when we got up there, this huge mud hole, that's what we found, and this truck of cabbages that was impossibly mired, and all these people who probably are stuck, at least some of them, helping to move vehicles along. And I just, so I think about my road right now, which Sally, my friend, came up and got me because I could not have passed through the ruts and mud holes on my road, but it was infinitely better than this one. Oops, wrong. And then we came to the Dadu River, which is what I said was the line that was the demarcation going up to the eastern rim of the Tibetan Plateau. And I had some of these photos with me. This one I didn't have with me, but now that is the one I took, and if you see the arrow there, I don't know if you can see, the road, it's very faint, but it's a road right along there. And it was when we were driving, it's not necessarily this place, but it's pretty close, because I recognized it because of just the mountains and everything. And I knew we were following on the same path. And I did not expect 75 years later to be following the exact path that my parents had taken, but there it is. And then, again, I want you to look at this arrow right down there. That is a truck. So that kind of gives you the scope and the scale of these mountains and the steepness of the gorges, narrow gorges. It's absolutely incredible and stunning. For me, I like that kind of thing. Not everyone. Some people might get a little claustrophobic in it. And then we're coming into the city of Chengdu, and obviously during my parents' time, it was this little trading crossroads, and like tea from the Yang'an area, men would carry a load of 364 pounds on their backs over the mountain passes and bring them to Chengdu. And they would be repacked onto yaks, and the yaks would take them further into Tibet. And also, if you've heard anything of the tea horse road coming up from southern China, the same thing. The tea the horses carried would be switched over to yaks. And in 1932, it was a mixture of Tibetans and Chinese, and it still is a mixture of Tibetans and Chinese. And still very much has a feeling of kind of a frontier city, even though it's way bigger than it was before. But it is in this very narrow valley, and here you're looking down at the river. I was standing on a bridge. Here, I'm across the river, looking. This is the bridge. These upside half circles there. That's the bridge. And there is a road right alongside the river on either side, and 2 more streets, and that's it. You can't build any more buildings because these are precipitously steep. So it's a very narrow city along the river. And the commercial center is still very much the way it used to be. It hasn't grown, but the people's homes just spread out for a couple of miles on down the river. We stayed there for 2 days, and then we headed up to the pass right here. And I was amazed that there had been so little change in how we're traveling. We got up near Chengdu Pass, and there was an encampment of yak and yak herders, and this is what they do in the summertime: is to take the yak up to the upper elevations, and this is close, probably about 14,000 feet, and let the yak graze up there, and then they bring them down 2 months later. My parents saw yak and yak herders in the same place. Here we are at the top of the pass, and that's my daughter, me, and my niece, and that is a big pile of prayer rocks underneath the prayer flags. Big square pile, mounded. And then the prayer flags go on up to the top of the peak. Then we drop down into the Tibetan Plateau grasslands, and everything changes. You still see some trees in places, but for the most part, there are no trees. And I put this house in there. Obviously, the buildings are quite different. They don't have the upturned eaves of the Chinese houses. And here, just to explain how they have their houses set up, the bottom floor is for storage and their yak and horses, whatever livestock they have. The second floor and then the other part of the third floor, the closed part, is their living space. And then the open area, there's an altar up there. Usually there's prayer flags. This one didn't have prayer flags. And they also dry barley and other crops that they grow up in that part of that open area there. And it was harvest time, and I think on this trip, I think I saw one truck in one field, and everything else, it was people were harvesting by hand. And you can see two people here, bent over, carrying barley stalks. This is barley here. It's their main crop, carrying it back to the village back there. And then I don't have a picture of this, of the building in the back there. This is a contemporary home in the front. But I had my father's account of their trip and with me, and I quickly looked through it and got the part that I was looking. Across the stream on the far slope stood a white stone building. Edgar said it was a Lama retreat. Edgar was their guide. And that's what Lama retreats look like, white with the red tile roofs. And so here again, this was another example of, we were really following on my parents' footsteps. Pretty exciting to me. And then we made our way into the Valley of the Yak. And we're coming in from the bottom of the valley, whereas my parents came in from the top. And they had come over the same pass we did when they made a first trip into the grasslands. And they were up there for a week, and they came back, and that's when they encountered the two mountaineers. And then they rode horses and came in from at the head of the valley, and they camped up there near a couple of yak hair tents, and they saw two bull yak almost ready to fight. And that's where I coined the description of the valley as Valley of the Yak, because I did not want to didn't want to highlight the people who had helped us out so much, because they're wonderful people, and things are not so great in China right now. And this is a linear pile of prayer rocks. Dad said he had never seen anything like that, or certainly never anything as long as that. That's at least 30 feet, if not more. And it looks a little different. It hasn't, the upkeep is hasn't been particularly good, but it's still there. And these are some of the rocks, the prayer rocks. And what the Tibetans believe is that if you find a money pile, you circumambulate it counterclockwise. Sorry, lost my word. Counterclockwise, and each time sends prayers into the universe. Oops, there. And these are all the Tibetans that helped us. On the left, we had 2 mountain guides that we picked up in Kangding and their driver. And then Mr. Chen, our driver, is in the tan coat. And behind him and to the right, this man here was our local guide, and that's his family surrounding Mr. Chen. And then me and my niece and my daughter. And my son, you didn't get a picture of my son because he always took the pictures. So now I can't tell you about the ending because that's the highlight of the book. That's, it builds to a crescendo. And I would love for you to buy the book and just get the full story. But I have something, I have another theme to add to the book, and that is how my affinity for China was the path to healing the rift with my mother and ultimately finding forgiveness. And I want to read this is something that relates to this particular theme. So this is after my mother, after I have come home from my mother's memorial service, after she died in 1999. So my parents were not alive when we made that trip in 2007. Children have only a partial understanding of who their parents are. A child's brain is not equipped to grasp the full measure of a mother or father, much less fathom the intricacies of adult relationships. The tributes from Mom's colleagues and the condolences of Mom's friends allowed me to gain a more complete picture of my mother. It was not unlike turning a crystal and seeing through a different facet, much like witnessing my mother greet her classmates in Chengdu in 1980. I welcomed this more complex, multifaceted view of her, as it allowed me to let the mother I grew up with recede in my memory. All these experiences and insights helped me process my grief and enabled me to let go of my childhood memories and the associated guilt and shame. I may always carry inside a yearning to have had a mother who was able to show her more tender feelings. And that's okay, because now I feel only love for her and compassion for the pain she carried in her heart for so long. Not until after the service, arriving home from a grueling 11-hour drive, did I feel the full force of my mother's death. As I inserted the key in my front door, my first thought, from force of habit, was that I had to call Mom and report my safe arrival home. She had insisted on each of my visits that I call so she knew I'd arrived safely. Every time this request had grated, I'd felt it was her way of treating me like a kid. With my hand still on the doorknob, I knew I'd had it all wrong. Her desire to hear of my safe arrival had come purely from her concern for me, from the love she could not show. Never again would she be making that request. Never again would she be at the end of the phone line. Sinking to a chair, I gave in to the fathomless grief washing over me. Thank you very much. Oops.